Yo, check this out. This is Wayne Wonder, representing for Warwick Hill TV. You see the vision, don't it? See the vision. Warwick Hill TV. Keep it locked.
I'm gonna tell you. We, us, as bloggers, these are the issues that we need to address. You understand what I say? Set the bar for the youth. Share, like, and subscribe, and stay tuned to the channel. I don't know all this shit.
Or we go to the phone lines now to speak with my very special guest, Dr. Mazeke Thame, on Jamaica and the neoliberal agenda. Dr. Thame, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Morning, Kabu, and thank you for inviting me. I have to big you up because you are keeping your fire blazing as it relates to, advocating on behalf of ordinary people and educating people, and that's very important in the public domain because our education is not only what happens at school.
Thank you so much for that. And, I was going to say to you before you big me up, that I attended the Zoom session we advertise at here from 7 continents on neoliberalism. And I sat there and I listened to you. And I thought, wow, you just touched on everything, but you did more than that. You put it into context for us. I know the understanding, I think, is important for us to really move. And I'd really, really appreciated what you did there. Wanted to bring it to this space also. And I see this as one of many interviews, if you can find the time. But
sure, I'm available.
All right.
Sometimes anyway. But thank you. Thank you for the good words.
Right. I'm going to say to our listeners, I know how it goes. You called me after the program to say, can I get a copy of this program? And it's fine. It's also fine to record it if you wish. We don't mind. So we want to talk about Jamaica and the neoliberal agenda, neoliberalism. But first of all, help us to understand what is neoliberalism.
All right. So I think we all know capitalism, right? I mean, we live it. Although if someone were to ask you, what is it? People might have difficulty explaining. And pretty simply, it's a system that has governed the world since the 15th century, the economic system, which is also political because wealth mediates power. And the source of wealth in capitalism is ownership of property. So capitalism is based on private ownership of property and the pursuit of profit as a motive for production. Now, people may take for granted that what other form of ownership of property exists. First of all, if we look at other societies historically, we would see that people didn't necessarily think that they should own the land. If you look at pre-colonial Africa, for instance, you don't own land. You keep land in trust for generations to come. And you work the land in a way that is honoring the ancestors and leaving, it in a state that the future generations can take, care of it, use of it, etc., etc. So land ownership or property ownership is a distinctly capitalist way of seeing how we relate to the earth and then also each other, because the question of, so who must work the land comes in, and those who control capital employ labor. Labor works, the surplus value of their labor goes to the capitalists in profit. And there is, for those who critique capitalism, there is an inherent problem in that what it's doing is producing poverty in the world, right? And we think about it in our own situation, we would have lived in a period of unwaged labor, slavery, and that wealth went to Europe, the wealth that was created here. So hundreds of years of accumulation of the wealth of Europeans largely, and we come to 1945, the end of World War II. the European world is a wreck, although because they had established colonialism elsewhere, the rest of the world is also paying for their wars through extraction of taxation and also bringing people into the war too, right? Africans fought, Jamaicans fought, etc. I'm giving you a long history.
But it's relevant. So, it's important for us to understand it within the historical context. Yes.
So that's the period of rebuilding for Europe, post-World War II. It's also a period in which labor is strong and labor unions are strong. And they are able to negotiate from a position of power to say that working conditions must be improved, wages must be improved, etc. So the post-1945 period is a period in which there is some redistribution of wealth within capitalism that goes downwards. And so it tempers capitalism. If there's this film that used to play a lot, I think, on TV when we were children, that showed mine workers including children in the UK as being, destitute.
Yes.
Though they were in capitalism, people at the bottom were not beneficiaries in early capitalism in Europe and the United States. So you have a period, and in the United States, the period of what we would call tempered capitalism is accredited to FDR and the use of Keynesian economics, which says that you have to mediate capitalism in a way that you're protecting people from greed, but you are also giving some social services. The state, particularly, is also playing a role in providing social welfare for people. Now, when we come into independence, that's popular. The whole world is agreed that the state must play a role in, creating conditions of quote-unquote development, which means that the state must also be an economic player so it can make money that will allow it to make provisions for education, health, cash transfer, welfare, public transport, all of these things that were considered quote-unquote public goods. In the 1970s, there is a debt crisis that is related to the oil crisis, the rising price of oil. We don't set prices for oil. We are price takers. We have to spend foreign exchange for that. So when oil prices go up, typically people like us become poorer. And one of the responses to that was to borrow money from the international financial community. That put us in debt. By the end of the 1970s, much of the developing world is heavily indebted. And the creditors are concerned about what is going to happen to their money. So they largely, I would put it in terms, devise a plan that says we can use the international monetary system to ensure that these developing countries repay the debt. The IMF and World Bank become important in this period in popularizing neoliberal economics. And neoliberal economics is simply a phase of capitalism that says that the market must be freed to do as it pleases. Presumably the market will always find equilibrium. Demand and supply should determine all things, and the state should not become involved in economic activities because it is actually acting as an obstacle to demand and supply finding the correct price. So the way that our crisis was explained in the late 1970s was that they said, the problem is that you guys' structure of your economies is problematic, and that needs to be fixed through what became known as structural adjustment programs.
Remember that?
And the exchange was, we will continue to lend you money, and you will continue to pay us interest, but you have to adjust your economies in order to allow for your economies to get it right. The structural adjustment programs had a one-size-fits-all slew of policies that included liberalizing trade and liberalizing the domestic market. Liberalizing trade would mean removing subsidies, removing taxes or duties on goods coming in. It would include devaluation that would, supposedly get our dollar right. Similar processes would relate to freeing the market and especially the financial sector, so that capital could now move freely across borders. Multinational corporations could relocate to places where labor was cheap, or I would say cheapened, and they could now have access to the markets of the entire world. They didn't have to stay in the developed world. They could take advantage of any opportunities, and that would allow for presumably, they could accumulate capital, and presumably we could now grow because we too had access to these markets outside, and it favored an export-driven model of large-scale production, whether it's in agriculture or manufacturing. Now, if you don't have economies of scale already, it means that you are going to compete with companies that have long histories, have significant capital, are able to invest wherever, take advantage of opportunities wherever. And ultimately, you are entering the fray at a disadvantage in that kind of economics. But at the same time, what is happening is that the state's role becomes no longer we are acting in the interest of the people on the side of democracy, but rather the role of the state becomes we are here to facilitate capital. We are here to facilitate the private sector.
To facilitate the private sector. Was there at any time, because obviously this took off, and many argue that neoliberalism has created the worst income inequality that we have ever seen. It has ravaged the Caribbean landscape and has exacted a punishing tribute, often in the form of dead peonage from the working class, and you've kind of outlined some of that. But you have said that the state, the Jamaican state, is fashioning itself within a neoliberal context, and I'm quoting you directly. You might recall that. Right. Explain that to us.
So, the neoliberal period is really the 1980s, and it has lasted since then till now. One of the things that the state has to do, or governments who come into control of the state, is to justify their existence, right? They have to win elections. They have to tell us what they have done for us and why we should vote for them. And one of the ways that they do it in a context where what we see around us is failure. People are getting poorer. Presently, crime is expanding. There is very little that we can say, maybe outside of the period of the 1970s, in which there is a slew of transformations that occur in relation to, ordinary people and legislative reform, things like maternity leave, etc. So we have to understand how it is that we are not getting better off. You tell us that growth is good. We see that growth is anemic, meaning it's very little, but also when growth happens, it doesn't trickle down, as neoliberalism argues that it will.
Right.
So how is it that we are doing everything and that we're supposed to do, and we are not reaping the benefits? In fact, things may even seem to be getting worse. So part of the reality of neoliberalism is that elites within all societies benefit. If you are well positioned, you can take advantage of opportunities. You don't have to worry about getting into the labor market. You don't have to worry about, whether you have capital to invest, etc. So if you already have capital, you are well placed. And elites within these societies may see themselves more along the lines of elites in the developed world. And our governments also play that role of aligning with multinational corporations and global elites. So there's a kind of political consensus around what the state should be doing. And then when they fail, they turn the lens on the public. Now, neoliberalism uses a kind of post-truth because what it does is to turn our focus away from structural problems.
Yes.
So we're no longer looking at histories of inequality and how you fix them. You are looking, you're trying to explain reality in a different kind of way. And the way that the Jamaican state has done it is through this language of personal responsibility. It's the same thing that the IMF and World Bank would have used to explain why we are failing. It's because you all are negligent. It's because you all don't know how to do economics. It's because you have some, internal failing, and you need to take responsibility. It was the language of good governance in relation to the state. And in turn, the state has turned that onto the people and they explain their failure by personal responsibility. It's your own fault why you cannot rise out of poverty. It's your own fault why you have crime. I mean, in the paper today, Horace Chang's explanation of the problems that we have of violence is the so-called gun culture. And, not, social science understandings that inequality produces crime, but rather we have some internal understandings of, how we should behave. And that is what we should use to explain everything in the universe, basically. So that's what I mean when I say, the state is fashioning itself, it's aligning itself with neoliberal dogma, neoliberal ideology, in a way that is explaining the world outside of structural explanations towards personal responsibility. And in this case, failure is explained through the people.
And when you talk about structural violence, for example, but let me just ask you a little bit. Could you go back a bit and talk about this idea? Because you talk about the neoliberal ideology. We're to understand this as an ideology, as a global concept, aren't we? We're to see this within a global context.
Well, I'm not.
And then how to connect that back to what we are experiencing here on the ground. Is it divorced from a greater plan then? Outside of
I'm
saying,
not sure I understand the question.
No, because you talk about. Here's the thing. You talk about neoliberalism being an ideology, and I wanted to understand that concept. This is not a buck up. This is a serious. This is an ideology that has taken root across the world, and it's global.
Right. So neoliberalism presents itself as not ideological, right? As just doing business, as just economics. But if we look at it, we will see that it is in fact, value. It has value attached to it. It's not value free. And the particular values that it advances are, a kind of preference for the market as determining, the market has its own logic, and we should accept that, and we should accept that it is correct. It's also going back to Margaret Thatcher, who was one of its proponents in the political realm, the kind of idea that says society does not exist. Individuals exist, and the focus should always be on individuals. And so you destroy collective organizing frames like unions and tell people that you should be entrepreneurs, free your entrepreneurial spirit, and that's the way to the future. And we begin to think of ourselves in that kind of way, right? So, if you talk to any young person, what do you want to be? Well, they might say a business scammer, but that's a kind of entrepreneur. Because in our case, the reason why that kind of entrepreneur emerges is because, again, of structural inequalities. What are the opportunities for people to legitimately find means? In the talk, I think that it's important for us to think about our context in terms of race and the history of race in our societies. In our case, blackness is also defining how we think about ourselves and the kinds of values that are attached to that. There's always a question for us, what is the worth of a black person? And that is attached to economics as well. What do you do with these people when you're done with them in slavery? In the United States, you can incarcerate them and put them to work, right? Here, because of our place in the global economy, we don't know what to do with these bodies. They become unemployed, and because we are not invested in education, that's a different conversation, but they are also oftentimes unemployable. And so they find themselves having to create their own context. Also, historically, the Jamaican state has not been committed to really transforming this society. So people become hustlers of various sorts. If they can go into music, that's legitimate. But if they go into scamming, it's something else, and we have to deal with the violence of that. But there's a way that we think about ourselves, in a kind of branded entrepreneurial frame that fits into the market logic that says, if we fix ourselves at the individual level, we can advance. And when I say that is ideological, I mean that there is a politics embedded within that is really based in individualism, and individualism as the ways that our societies are being increasingly, transformed.
And one of the things I heard you say in that presentation also is that black governments themselves participate in the cheapening of black labor through the rebirth of things like the BPOs. And I wanted to go there a bit to talk about how labor and neoliberalism, and especially within the Jamaican context. You mentioned unions just now, and a light bulb went off in my head because I've been asking the question, what happened to the unions? So let's talk about that.
Governments participated in union busting. Margaret Thatcher's union busting she took down the strongest union in the UK, which would have been the miners' union, right? Unions, part of the problem with unions in our society is that they were connected to the political party. So there is always a question, how can you have an independent union that is also attached to the political party? What is going to be their agenda? Is it for the people, or is it aligned with the political party? And that is, a kind of inherent contradiction that exists here. But as it relates to the BPOs, the question is, so what is it that we imagine to be the fate of these black people who have been long suffering, right? What is it that we are putting in place to change their realities on the ground? And we have come up with tourism, extractive economies, largely is how we operate, and scholars like George Beckford would have called this plantation economics, in that the same model that is based on low wage, in the case of slavery it would have been free labor, but it's the same model that is low wage, extractive in the sense that profits go abroad. So you have, if you think about even the ownership of tourism currently, I don't know, I don't have the statistics, but that there are significant international players.
Of course. Yes.
And we see, who is putting up hotels. And of course, there's the issue there of, so while you are building hotels along the coast and you are employing black people as low-wage workers who are also contract workers, which means that they have no protections, and you are at the same time denying them access to the resources of the nation because they can't even go to the beach. So the privatization, which is a part of neoliberalism, the privatization of public assets, the enrichment of individuals at the expense of the poor, both in terms of, what they can have access to, but also the way in which their labor is used comes into question. In the early neoliberal period of the 1980s, you had export processing zones where, these factories would come in, set up the textile sector really. In Haiti, it was the most oppressive, most advanced in the Caribbean, taking advantage of low wages here and then, exporting these brand name clothes for that are sold in the developed market for significant profit. And of course, it's women. It's women whose labor stays in these sectors because in our society especially, women are 51% of households are headed by women. They're taking care of families. What is the chance that they're going to opt out of whatever is available to them? They're going to accept low wages and they are going to be producing, brand name goods that they can't themselves buy. And if not that, because the question is what is available to them in terms of work, they're going to be leaving Jamaica, and migration has always been important for us, right, as a source of improving our economic standing. And they're also leaving their families behind, so there are consequences attached to that they are social.
Yes.
And the structure of the economy ultimately is not changing. It's not creating possibilities beyond the historical place of places like Jamaica in the global economy. And we remain poor, we remain, people don't use the language of oppression too much these days because if you accept personal responsibility, then you aren't oppressed. But in my understanding, this is what people are.
Right. And you talk about the dependence also on agriculture, the shifting from the dependence on agriculture to tourism as part of the neoliberal project that we see, or agenda that we see here on the island.
It's a certain kind of agriculture that gets a pass in neoliberalism. It's large-scale agriculture for export. So it means that, small farmers will only benefit to a certain degree in that kind of model. But if we think about the needs of the internal economy, that is, we saw in COVID, for example, that a lot of farmers had this massive buildup of tomatoes, things like tomatoes. That's because they were farming for the hotel sector. They weren't farming for the local needs of the population. So you have farmers that are competing in the local market with imported produce, because in the neoliberal period it says you can't subsidize, even while the U.S. government is subsidizing heavily its dairy sector, its rice sector, its agriculture overall. We don't get to do that. And we accept many of these ideas. A lot of it is imposed, by IMF agreements, etc. But we also are not negotiating alternate terms, partly because I think we are not doing the work of thinking about how we could transform these societies. And if we look at a sector like agriculture, it's not just about producing food. It's also that people who are farming are living on their land. So agriculture is providing shelter for them at the same time. They're being able to feed themselves. There are multiple economies that are attached to it, but we are oriented towards export markets, service sector, and the service sector is the BPO, the tourism, for instance. And I would argue that the economy is not oriented towards dealing with our basic needs in this society. So you have people in Jamaica, people are not guaranteed 3 meals a day. And even if they are eating, what are they eating? So we're not even food secure.
Right. And that's a whole other conversation.
Right.
So then it leads me to think of the consequences of neoliberalism then in the current pandemic. Your own thinking on that?
So, to me, it was an opportunity for us to rethink, right? Yes, I get that we are not powerful in the world, etc. But you have to take advantage of space when it is created. And the space that is created sometimes is just that the developed world is not, and America in particular, the US in particular, is not paying attention to you. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that Mia Motley has done in Barbados is to use the pandemic to call for things like rethinking international debt. Mm-hmm. Because the logic of the debt arrangement is such that we will be perpetually squeezed. And when Nigel Clark says we can't do anything about this, it's not true, because these arrangements are negotiated, right? And in Mia's case, what she did was to reduce the surplus, the fiscal surplus. So they said, we're not going to be holding all this money in reserve while people are not eating. Mm-hmm. We are going to do something else with our society. And if we don't take opportunities like these that say, oh my God, the whole world is suffering, it means that we should focus on people, then we lose that opportunity and we continue along in the same path in which all that has happened is that conditions have worsened. Mm-hmm. So people are even worse off, and they were not in any good condition before, because the pandemic produces its own, logic of inequality, and people who don't have means are the ones who suffer most.
Mm-hmm. Can you hold a line for me, please, Dr. Thame? A quick break and we'll be right back. Right, we're back with you inside of the Africa Forum. It is Running Africa, and my very special guest online is Dr. Mazeke Thame. She is a senior lecturer in the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies. We're talking about Jamaica and the neoliberal agenda, learning so much in the session. Dr. Thame, how does neoliberalism envision social justice? Because we talked about, as an economic system, it was about the freedom of the market. But how does it envision social justice?
Well, I wouldn't say social justice is a part of the neoliberal framing, because if you accept Margaret Thatcher's notion that there is no such thing as a society, then what are we talking about when we talk about the social? We move from the social to the individual. Mm-hmm. And the individual is expected to do the work of improving their own conditions. Mm-hmm. In neoliberalism, the understanding is if you free the market and entrepreneurial spirit, etc., etc., then you'll have growth, and growth will trickle down. Mm-hmm. So it's in the trickle down that we are, supposedly getting better off.
So this is so hence social inequality and increasing inequalities in the world.
Precisely. And the inequality is both between nations and within nations. So poor countries have gotten poorer, and internally inequality has increased. And if you look at even in the COVID pandemic, you have, individuals who have gotten significantly richer. The people who are already rich able to, put their money in the financial sector, and people, play the stock exchange, etc., and get richer if you have capital. So yeah, the inequality is statistically rising everywhere.
In the presentation you made, some of the things you referenced, which I want to, in the last 10 minutes that we have, to kind of look at. You talk about the production of the unemployed, and also about the overproduction of the unemployable, the failure of a state backed by violence, which is a feature of neoliberalism. Can you elaborate on that a bit in this space?
All right. So we have to think about the way in which neoliberalism was imposed in the first place, and Chile is the first test case. When it happened in Chile, it happened via a coup that removed the President Allende from power and installed Pinochet, and the privatization of everything, the market logic followed, but it followed in a context of, putting a stop to expressions of social discontent. Essentially authoritarian government backed by the United States. And the U.S. is always present in our politics, right, in the region and globally, of course. So there's a force that happens at that level in terms of the imposition of neoliberalism against the will of the people. In addition to that, the violence occurs, and I think of it as such, when the IMF is able to tell us how to govern. There's a certain inherent violence involved in that. It's anti-democratic.
Yeah.
When you have international agencies managing your state, when people have other ambitions for themselves. In our case, because you have a history of inequality, a history of poverty, etc., the work of independent state, if you want to change the context, means you have to deal with the histories. You have to seek to transform those histories in various different ways. And one of the ways that has been very important in Jamaica is, of course, the expansion of education, the democratization of education.
Mm-hmm.
But somewhere along the line, education became a means of weeding children out of the process.
Wow.
It occurs very early, right? With all these exams that they have to take in order to get to high school and to get a better education and ultimately to move up in the system. So at 11 years old, your future is almost decided in this society, right? Mm-hmm. And if education is a means to social mobility, many people would contest that, especially presently, because you have university graduates who remain, let's say, if at best, precariously middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And that is partly due to our location in the global economy. But it is also due to the kind of attention that we have paid to education that is quite happy to allow for children to fail, and to fail very early.
Mm-hmm.
And when they become adults, they are unable to fit into the formal structures of employment. So the informal sector is very large in Jamaica, not just the criminal sector in the sense of people who are engaged in, activities that we focus on when it comes to criminality, because in my mind, criminality stretches beyond what happens in the process whereby someone kills someone else and
mm-hmm.
we incarcerate them, etc.
Mm-hmm.
There's also an informal sector that is based in, just small-scale hustling, where people are selling callaloo on the street for the whole day long, and what do they end up with in the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a kind of structural violence there of neglect, of the refusal to attend to the history of inequality that, needs to be fixed. But also, because it produces this sector that is unable to advance in the formal, it means that in the case of Jamaica, it has meant that these sectors are high competition, they're dangerous. You're talking about transnational drug trade, you're talking about a lot of scamming, you're talking about various forms of scamming, and in that process, and this is related to our history too of political violence. I don't want to say that it's only based in the economic process,
mm-hmm.
but there is a violence produced in it that the state has to respond to. And it's a violence that is, I would say, horizontal, in terms of who is at risk. It's poor people who experience predation.
Mm-hmm.
And the state has responded with its own violence against not just the criminals themselves,
yes.
but entire communities that are criminalized,
mm-hmm.
are stigmatized because of their historical location in our society.
And now we see a situation where the police is being militarized, and I find it very interesting.
Well, policing is militarized,
mm-hmm.
so the JDF is playing an important role.
Mm-hmm.
There is an expansion of the funding available to the JDF. The JDF is being deployed in the streets. And one of the ways that you can do this or justify it is through this notion that we are in a state of emergency, mm-hmm. because it gives extraordinary powers to the state.
Mm-hmm.
And, we are to understand that we are in an extraordinary moment, requiring extraordinary responses, and the response is not a social one. It's not about fixing the inequality. It's one that is about putting down communities and people, because it's not necessarily criminals that experience this, right? It's the people who are living in the zones that are determined to be criminal. So whole communities are stigmatized in this process. And it's because we have already thought of those communities in that way that we think it is appropriate to handle them in that way. And there's, before the violence rate was what it is, this is also the history of our independence. I mean, the 1960s and the Baca Wall, the removal of so-called squatters, the construction of housing units. You know, I mean, if you read the newspapers of the day, the way they describe the way these communities were burned out, women were living with their children in Maypen Cemetery because they had nowhere to go. And that kind of violence is a part of how we have managed our people leading up to the present, and we take it for granted that we deserve it.
You know, I'm jumping all over the place here, and I need to get in a few more things with just 4 minutes. But one of the things that you underscored in your presentation was the collapse of the Independence Project. As we go into our 60th year, take a minute, which I know is unfair to you, to help our listeners to understand that the collapse of the Independence Project, even as we go into 60 years of independence, so-called.
Well, I don't know. Let's say the collapse of the decolonial project more so than the Independence Project, because the Independence Project, you know, is a particular kind of middle-class, brown nationalist, Creole nationalist project that is constructing the nation in a way that legitimizes brown rule, for instance, and you know that's not necessarily decolonization.
Yes,
decolonization would be about, you know, contending with the legacy of colonialism and doing away with it. And we see expressions of it in the treatment of Nzinga, for instance. Even before she gets into the jail cell, you know, the way how she is treated on the streets. Why do we believe that it is acceptable that the police should treat ordinary people in the way that they do, and then we justify it on the basis that the woman wasn't wearing a mask? And ultimately, for me, the independence or decolonization project has to do with restoring the dignity of black people who are a majority in this society and who experience the worst conditions, particularly when they are poor. And I don't know that there are reversals that have come within the neoliberal period that kind of justify it on the basis that, you know, if black people have nothing to show for their struggles, etc., they may rely on this idea that says that something is wrong with them. And so, you know, there is no alternative if the problem is that it's personal responsibility that is at stake. And a lot of work has to go into transforming the society around the dignity of black people who are the people who experience oppression in this society, even though it's black majority.
With the Jamaican government being such an active participant in the neoliberal project, how do we realize this? Does it take a revolution to make a solution?
Well, it certainly takes a revolution in ideas. It takes some real serious rethinking of, you know, how the state positions itself in the world and how it positions itself in relation to people, and also for people to figure out by some means what is really at stake and to take some action around it. We cannot be satisfied with receiving remittances as the way of the future. We should not be satisfied with feeding everything to foreigners, the beach, the mountain, the cockpit, the, whatever it is. I think ordinary people don't necessarily believe in a Jamaican project. They don't necessarily believe in Jamaica and themselves. And so the Jamaican dream is, how can I get to foreign? And for me, that's a problem, because obviously you're going to face problems there too. But also we have something, and we have, Jamaican people, even though they are full of problems, they're also taking care of each other. And if we are able to build on the things that we do well, the tremendous talent that shows itself, despite the odds, then that's a place to start. So the revolution doesn't necessarily come in the way we imagined it. If we're thinking through chair and taking up arms against
revolution
and whatnot.
It comes first of all with a shift in the paradigm.
Right. Rethinking how we value ourselves and what we demand for ourselves in the nation.
Well, let us start that process. I want to continue this conversation with you, Dr. Thame, if you don't mind, and we'll just reach out to you again. I know this has to be a series. When I heard you, I